On the Friday evening before her wedding, a woman named Claire sat down at a corner table at the Chattanooga Choo-Choo Hotel and watched her father's face appear on a laptop screen. He had been dead for almost 2 years. Her mother had kept the video. Robert Harmon had recorded it in November 2022, 1 month before he died of pancreatic cancer, at the kitchen table of the house where Claire grew up. There was a cup of coffee in front of him that he never touched. He said he didn't know who she was marrying. He hoped he was a good man. Then he told her what he had seen from a hospital window in October. He had been at Erlanger Medical Center for a palliative procedure. Claire had been inside with him for 7 hours. At 2 in the afternoon, he had looked out his recovery room window and seen a truck in the parking lot. He recognized it. He asked his wife, Margaret, to confirm it. It was James Whitfield's truck. Robert watched that window for the rest of the afternoon. The truck didn't move. James never came in. He never texted. Claire was on her phone several times, and Robert watched for a message that didn't come. James just sat there, in case she needed someone outside. Robert said he didn't know if Claire knew this. He didn't think she did. He didn't think James had told her. He said he was telling her now so she would know what it looked like when someone decided to be there for you without being asked and without needing you to know about it. Then he said 7 words. Marry the man who waited outside. Claire looked up from the laptop. James Whitfield was across the room, talking to her fiancé's brother, laughing at something, completely unaware. James was a history teacher at the school where Claire's father had been principal for 22 years. He and Claire had been friends for 10 years. They had dated briefly in 2016 and had decided the friendship was more important. His wife, Rachel, had died in 2020. His daughter, Ada, was 6 years old. Claire had brought food to his house every Tuesday for 6 months after Rachel died because Tuesday was the day Rachel used to cook. When Ada was 5, she had asked James why Aunt Claire came over so much. James had said she was his best friend. Ada had said she wanted Claire to be her mom. James had said no. He had been in love with Claire since 2017. Neither of them had said anything because the friendship was the most important thing, and the risk was too large, and the unnamed version was already the most precious thing either of them had. Claire called her fiancé at 7 in the morning. She told him there had been someone else for 8 years and she hadn't known it until last night. He said he'd been watching the two of them for 6 months. He said he thought she was going to figure it out before today. She called James at 9. She told him her father had seen him. She told him about the parking lot and the video. She said she wasn't getting married. She told him to come over. He said he was already in the car. He was at the door in 12 minutes. My father's face appeared on the laptop screen at 8:47 p.m. on the Friday before my wedding. He had been dead for almost 2 years. My mother had set the laptop on the corner table at the Chattanooga Choo-Choo Hotel and had sat beside me and had taken my hand and had said, "He left this for you, for your wedding day. I've been keeping it." The video was 2 minutes and 40 seconds long. I watched my father, Robert Harmon, recorded November 2022, 1 month before he died, look at the camera with the specific quality of a man who has arranged what remains of his time with great care and who is using this portion of it to say something he has decided needs to be said. He looked healthy in the video, or healthier than he had been by December. The November quality of him, the specific diminishment that pancreatic cancer produced over months, was present but not yet complete. His eyes were clear. He was at the kitchen table of the house where I grew up. There was a cup of coffee in front of him that he did not touch during the recording. He said, "Claire, I don't know who you're marrying. I hope he's a good man. I hope he makes you happy in all the ways you deserve to be happy. But I want to tell you something I saw, so you know what a good man looks like when you see one." In October, when I was in the hospital for the procedure, I looked out my window at 2 in the afternoon, and I saw James Whitfield's truck in the parking lot. I asked your mother to check. She confirmed it was his. I watched that window for the rest of the afternoon. The truck didn't move. He didn't come in. He didn't text you. You were on your phone several times, and I would have seen if you'd gotten a message from him. He just sat there, in case you needed someone outside. I don't know if you know this. I don't think you do. I don't think he told you. I'm telling you now because I want you to know what it looks like when someone has decided to be there for you without being asked and without needing you to know about it. Marry the man who waited outside, Claire. That's all. The video ended. I looked up from the laptop. Across the rehearsal dinner room, James Whitfield was talking to Preston's brother about something, laughing at something, easy and present, completely unaware that he was the subject of a recording my father had made almost 2 years ago and that my mother had been keeping for my wedding and that I had just watched. I had been at that hospital for 7 hours on that Tuesday in October. I had not known James was in the parking lot. He had been there for 7.5 hours, and he had not told me, and I had not known, and my father had watched from a recovery room window and had said nothing, and had recorded a video, and my mother had kept it for almost 2 years, and the wedding was tomorrow. I looked at my mother. She said, "I know." I said, "Why didn't he tell me?" She said, "Your father thought it wasn't his to tell. He said if you needed to know, you'd find your way to knowing." I said, "He made a video." She said, "He said that was different. He said that was just making sure." I looked across the room at James. He had not looked up. He had not felt my looking, or, if he had, he was giving me the specific privacy of not acknowledging it, which was the kind of thing he did. The specific quality of a man who understood what you needed before you asked for it. 7.5 hours. I picked up my glass of water and I set it down again. Preston was 30 feet away, talking with his parents, doing what Preston did at social events, managing the room with the specific competent ease of someone who had been doing this his whole life. I looked at Preston. I looked at James. I had been choosing between them for 6 months without knowing that was what I was doing. My father had known in October 2022 from a recovery room window. Let me tell you about the parking lot before I tell you about the 8 years, because the parking lot is what my father saw, and what my father saw is where the story starts. My father, Robert Harmon, had been the principal of East Ridge High School in Chattanooga for 22 years. He had retired in 2014, the same year James Whitfield had been hired to teach history there, which was not a coincidence exactly, but was not entirely coincidental either. My father had been on the hiring committee in his final year. He had reviewed James Whitfield's application and had told the committee that this was the kind of teacher a school built its history department around. He had been right. He had been right about most things. Pancreatic cancer was diagnosed in May 2022. My father was 67 years old and had been in good health for 67 years, which was the specific cruelty of a cancer that arrived in good health and did not leave it alone. His oncologist had told him the prognosis carefully, and my father had listened carefully and had made his arrangements with the specific efficiency of a man who had spent 30 years managing large institutions and who understood how to organize a transition. He had been in the hospital in October for a palliative procedure, pain management, slowing the progression, the specific medical intervention that is not about recovery but about quality in the remaining time. My mother Margaret had been there. I had been there. My father had been there in the way that he was everywhere. Fully present, entirely himself, not performing equanimity but genuinely in possession of it. I had been inside with him for 7 hours. I had not known James was outside for 7.5. My father had seen James's truck from the recovery room window at 2 in the afternoon. He had asked my mother to confirm it. My mother had looked and confirmed, and they had both known, without discussing it, what the truck in the parking lot meant. My father had watched the window for the rest of the afternoon. At 6:30, I had come out of the hospital into the October evening, and James had been leaning against his truck in the parking lot, and he had said, "I thought you might need someone to drive you home." I had said, "How long have you been here?" He had said, "A while." I had understood, in a way that I had not examined, that a while was longer than he was saying. I had not asked how much longer, because we had been friends for 8 years, and I knew when James was giving me something without making me name it. We had driven home in the dark. He had not told me about the parking lot. I had not asked. My father had watched from a window and had said nothing, and had made a video 3 weeks later, and my mother had kept it for almost 2 years. It was the Friday before my wedding. James Whitfield and I had met in September 2014. I was 24 years old, recently graduated from UTC with a degree in graphic design, working at a firm in downtown Chattanooga, and newly returned to the city after 4 years of college. He was 26, newly hired at East Ridge High School, Showing up at the first faculty social event of the year with the specific quality of someone who was new somewhere and who was deciding how to be new somewhere. Present, attentive, not performing comfort he did not yet have. My father had brought me to the faculty social because my mother was visiting her sister and he had no one to go with, and because I was home, and he had always brought me to school events when I was small, and the habit persisted into adulthood. I had met James Whitfield beside the snack table at a school gymnasium social, and we had talked for 2 hours about Tennessee history, which he was passionate about in the specific way of someone who had chosen to teach something, because they genuinely could not understand why everyone was not as interested in it as they were. We had become friends, not cautiously, immediately, in the specific way of friendships that do not develop gradually, but that are simply there from the beginning. We had dated briefly in 2016. 6 weeks, a decision made by both of us with full awareness of the risk to the friendship, ended by mutual agreement that the friendship was more important and that we were better as the thing we already were. The end of it had not been dramatic or painful. It had been the specific decision of 2 people who loved each other too much to let the romantic version damage the real version. James had met Rachel in 2017. She was a nurse at Erlanger. Kind and direct, and with the specific quality of someone who had spent her career in difficult realities and who had come home from them with her warmth intact. I had liked Rachel immediately and without reservation. Ada was born in 2018. Rachel suffered a ruptured cerebral aneurysm in March 2020. She died 4 days later. Ada was 2 years old. I had brought food to James's house every Tuesday for the first 6 months after Rachel died. Not because anyone asked me to, because Tuesday was the day James had told me Rachel used to make dinner, a specific Tuesday tradition they had developed, and I had understood without being told that Tuesdays were the specific shape of the absence. I had brought food on Tuesdays for 6 months. James had never asked me to stop. I had eventually stopped because he had started cooking again on Tuesdays, which I understood was the right thing. Which I understood because James and I had been understanding things about each other without explaining them for 6 years by then. This was the 8 years. Not dramatic, not unrequited longing in the movie sense. The specific ordinary texture of 2 people who had been the most important person in each other's lives for 8 years, and who had not named it because naming it required risking something neither of them was willing to risk, and because the unnamed version was already the most precious thing either of them had. I had met Preston in 2022. He had come into my firm to commission a branding project, and he had been easy to be with and clearly interested, and had asked me to dinner with the specific direct confidence of a man who did not waste time. I had liked him. I had said yes to dinner, and yes to the months that followed, and yes to the proposal in December 2023. I had not understood, when I said yes to Preston, that I was also saying something about James. My father had understood it from a recovery room window. Ada Whitfield was 6 years old. She had her father's patience and her mother's directness and a specific quality of attention to the world that produced, in the adults around her, the occasional sensation of being accurately assessed by a very small person. She had been coming to James's school plays and faculty events and school picnics since she was 3 years old because James brought her to everything that was appropriate to bring a child to, which was his approach to being a single parent. Ada was part of his life, not a separate department of it. She had known me since she was born. She had known me in the specific way of a child who knows certain adults as fixtures. Not visitors, not guests, simply people who were always there in the way that certain people were always there. When she was 5, she had asked James, in my presence on a Sunday afternoon in James's kitchen, why Aunt Claire came over so much. James had said, "Because she's my best friend." Ada had considered this. Then she had said, "Is she going to be my mom?" James had said, "No, Bug, she's just my best friend." Ada had said, "Okay." She had looked at me, "But I want her to be." I had not known what to do with this for 8 months. I had put it in the place where I put things I did not know what to do with, which was not a comfortable place but was where they lived until I was ready. I had not been ready until my father's face appeared on a laptop screen at a rehearsal dinner and told me about a truck in a parking lot. I did not sleep on the Friday night before my wedding. I lay in the room of the house where I grew up, and I looked at the ceiling and I thought about 7.5 hours. Not abstractly, specifically. I thought about what 7.5 hours meant as a choice. I thought about James leaving his house, driving to the hospital, parking the truck, sitting in a parking lot for 7.5 hours without coming in, without texting, without needing me to know he was there. I thought about what a person was deciding when they made that choice, what they were deciding about the other person, and what they were deciding about themselves. I thought about 6 weeks in 2016 and the decision we had made at the end of them. I thought about Tuesdays. I thought about my father watching the parking lot from a recovery room window in October 2022, watching the truck not move, understanding what the not moving meant, saying nothing for the specific reason that it was not his to say. I thought about him recording a video in November and the specific care with which he had chosen his words. Marry the man who waited outside. Not marry James. Not you're making a mistake. Not an argument or a case or a list of reasons. One image. One sentence. One piece of information delivered with the specific trust of a father who believed his daughter could be given the truth and could be trusted to know what to do with it. I picked up my phone at 7 in the morning. I called Preston. He answered on the second ring. His voice had the quality of someone who had been awake for a while already. I said, "I need to talk to you." He said, "I know." I said, "Preston." He said, "I saw you last night, when you were watching him." I did not say anything. He said, "Is there someone else?" I said, "There has been someone else for 8 years. I didn't know it until last night." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "James." It was not a question. I said, "I'm sorry." He said, "Don't be." A pause, the specific pause of a man who was being larger than the moment required him to be. "I've been watching you two for 6 months. I thought you were going to figure it out before today." I said, "Preston." He said, "Claire, don't apologize again. Just go figure it out." The line went quiet. I sat on the edge of my childhood bed in the house where my father had lived for 40 years, and where my father had recorded a video at the kitchen table, and where the specific quality of his absence was everywhere in the specific way of absences that belonged to people who had been fully present. I called James at 9. He answered on the first ring. I said, "I need to tell you something." He said, "Okay." I said, "My father saw you, at the hospital, in October 2022. The line was quiet. I said, "He watched the parking lot for the rest of the afternoon. He recorded a video. My mother showed it to me last night." James said, "Claire." I said, 7.5 hours, James." He did not say anything. I said, "I'm not getting married today." He said, "Claire." I said, "I'm at my parents' house. Come over." He said, "I'm already in the car." And he was at the door in 12 minutes. He had driven from North Chattanooga to my parents' house in 12 minutes, which told me the car had been running when I called, and that the specific thing I had always understood about James, that he was always already moving toward me before I asked, had been as true as I had understood it to be. I opened the door. He was in his Friday clothes, the clothes he had been wearing at the rehearsal dinner the night before, which told me he had not been home. He had been somewhere in Chattanooga in the Friday night and the Saturday morning in the clothes from the night before, and I understood, looking at him, that he had not slept either. He looked at me. I said, "Come in." He came in. My mother was in the kitchen, which was her way of being present without being present, available if needed, giving us the room. I could hear her doing something with the coffee maker. James and I stood in the living room of the house where I had grown up, surrounded by 40 years of my parents' life, the photographs on the wall, the furniture that had been in the same places since I was 7, the specific accumulated presence of a family that had been entirely itself in this space for a very long time. James said, "I didn't tell you." I said, "I know." He said, "I should have." I said, "No. You were right not to. It wasn't something to tell." He said, "Then what was it?" I said, "It was something to see." He looked at me. I said, "My father saw it. He needed me to see it." James said, "What did he say?" I said, "He said marry the man who waited outside." James sat down on the couch. Not dramatically, the specific sitting of someone whose legs have decided to do what the rest of him has not yet caught up with. He put his head in his hands for a moment. Then he looked up. He said, I've been in love with you since 2017. I said, I know. He said, I didn't say anything because... I said, because the friendship was the most important thing. He said, yes. I said, you were right. He said, was I? I said, the friendship was the most important thing. It still is. It's also not the only thing. He looked at me with the specific quality he had been looking at me with for 10 years. The look I had categorized as friendship, and that I now understood was something that had never fit cleanly into any category I had tried to put it in. He said, what about Preston? I said, I called him this morning. He said, Claire. I said, he said he'd been watching us for 6 months and thought I was going to figure it out before today. James was quiet. He said, he's a decent man. I said, yes, he is. He said, I'm sorry. I said, don't be. He told me not to apologize. He told me to go figure it out. James looked at the living room. He looked at the photographs on the wall. My father at various ages, my mother, me at various ages, the specific photographic record of a family that had lived here fully. He found the photograph of my father, the one from 2018, my father at 63, at a school event, the specific quality of a man who had spent his whole life in the right place for him and who wore it the way comfortable people wore things. James looked at that photograph for a long time. He said, he saw me. I said, yes. He said, I didn't know he saw me. I said, I know. He said, I thought you might need someone outside. I didn't think it was something anyone would notice. I said, my father noticed? He said, yes. I said, he watched for the rest of the afternoon. James looked at the photograph of my father. He said quietly, thank you, Robert. Not to me, to the photograph, to the man in it who had watched a parking lot from a recovery room window and had known what he was watching and had said nothing for the right reasons and had eventually found the right way to say everything. My mother came in from the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee. She set them on the table. She looked at James. She looked at me. She said, he liked you very much, James, from the beginning. James said, I know, I liked him. She said, he used to say you were the kind of teacher that changed the direction of things for students. He said that about very few people. James said, that's the kindest thing anyone has ever said about my work. She said, he meant it. She looked at me. He meant all of it. She went back to the kitchen. James and I sat in the living room with the coffee and the photographs and the specific quality of a Saturday morning that had not gone the way anyone had planned, and that was, for exactly this reason, going the only way it could have gone correctly. After a while, James said, Ada. I said, what about her? He said, she asked me last year if you were going to be her mom. I said, I know, I was there. He said, I said no. I said, I know. He said, I said the wrong thing. I looked at him. He said, not wrong in the sense of untrue, wrong in the sense of, I said the thing that protected the friendship instead of the thing that was true. I said, what was the true thing? He said, that I wanted her to be right, that I had wanted it since she asked. I said, James. He said, yeah. I said, she's with your father today. He said, yes. I said, can we go get her? He looked at me. I said, I'd like to see her today, if that's okay. He said, Claire. I said, I've been bringing food on Tuesdays for 4 years. I've been at every school play and every October picnic and every Saturday morning in your kitchen. I've been there. He said, you have. I said, that's also waiting outside. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, yes, it is. I said, so let's go get Ada. He stood up. He picked up his coffee cup and looked at the photograph of my father one more time. He said, he was right, you know. I said, I know. He said, about all of it. I said, he usually was. James smiled. The specific James smile that I had been seeing for 10 years and that I had catalogued incorrectly for at least 6 of them. He said, ready? I said, I've been ready since October 2022. I just didn't know it yet. We drove to Dennis Whitfield's house in North Chattanooga to get Ada. Dennis was James's father, 65 years old, retired, with the specific quality of a man who had watched his son carry significant weight for 4 years and who was ready, without needing to say so, for the weight to be redistributed. He opened the door when he heard the car. He looked at James. He looked at me. He said, "Well." James said, "Well." Dennis said, "Ada's in the backyard. She's been asking when you were coming." He looked at me again. He said, "I'm glad you're here, Claire." I said, "Thank you, Dennis." He said, he would have liked today. I said, "I know." Ada came around the side of the house at a run, 6 years old in her Saturday clothes, with the specific quality of a child who has been told something is happening and who has decided she is not going to miss it. She stopped when she saw me. She said, "Aunt Claire." I said, "Hi, Bug." She said, "Are you married?" I said, "No." She thought about this. She said, "Are you going to be?" I looked at James. James said, "That's a conversation for another day." Ada said, "But maybe?" He said, "Maybe." Ada looked at me with the specific assessment of a 6-year-old who had been carrying a question for a year and who was deciding whether maybe was enough. She said, "Okay." She reached up and took my hand. We stood there in Dennis Whitfield's front yard in Chattanooga, Tennessee, on a Saturday morning in June that had not gone the way it was planned to go, which was the reason it had gone the only way it could. I thought about my father at the kitchen table in November 2022 with the coffee he did not touch. I thought about what he had seen from a recovery room window and what he had understood and the specific patient trust of a man who had decided to say nothing until he had the right thing to say and had then said the right thing in 2 minutes and 40 seconds and had trusted his daughter to know what to do with it. He had been right. He had been right about James from 2014 when he had reviewed the application. He had been right from the parking lot window in 2022. He had been right in November when he had looked at the camera and said the only thing he needed to say, "Marry the man who waited outside." I had found him. He had been there the whole time. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Has there been someone in your life, someone who was always just there, consistently, without asking for recognition, without needing you to know, who you eventually understood was the most important person in your story? Sometimes we name things late. Sometimes we need someone wiser to point at what we were already looking at. Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. If this story stayed with you today, share it with one person who needs to hear it. You already know who that is. And if you're new here, subscribe. Every week, a story like this one. Real people. Real decisions. The kind that stay with you.